Good morning. My name is Charlie Parham, and I'm a very grateful recovering alcoholic. Because I'm a member of the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous, and by the grace of the power that I found through the 12-step program of Alcoholics Anonymous, I haven't found necessary to take a drink for 5,014 days today, one day at a time, and for this I'm very grateful. I hope God will forgive Bob for all the bragging that he did on us. I hope he'll forgive me if I sit here and enjoyed it all the time he was doing it also. Before we get into this thing this morning, let's start by saying that this is a completely informal thing. We don't try to structure it. We never know for sure what we're going to do. I start at one place and Joe starts at another place, and sometimes we get our roles reversed. We start at the wrong places. We're going to be sitting here for quite a while this morning. If you feel the urge to get up and walk around a little bit, or you feel the urge to get up and get a cup of coffee, or if you feel the urge to get up and get rid of a cup of coffee, feel free to do so. We're used to this, and it's a long time to sit still and do nothing. So feel free to do whatever you feel like you need to do also. I might start by saying that we do not consider ourselves to be the experts or the gurus of the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Joe and I met several years ago, and we found that we both had a mutual interest in the big book. We found that for the first time we had run into another person who was interested in talking about the fact that perhaps the chapters of the book were put there in a certain sequence to convey certain ideas and do certain things for us. We like to think that since that time we've learned a little bit about the book, and we're simply here today to try to share with you whatever it is that we have been lucky enough to learn. We do not speak for AA as a whole. You're free to agree or disagree with anything that you see fit. In fact, we would recommend that you pay no attention to anything which cannot be reconciled with what is in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And we'll try to keep most of our remarks today basically centered on what is in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Joe, would you like to say a few words before we start?
My name is Joe, and I'm definitely an alcoholic. And through God's grace, because this program works one day at a time in my life, it hadn't been necessary for me to take a drink since March the 10th of 1962, and for this I'm extremely grateful. It's good to be here this morning. And as Charlie says, we met by chance one night doing, of all places, an Al-Anon convention. And this was many years ago, nine years ago, I imagine. And at the time, I had been on the big book for about a year, had some ideas of the chapters, and I was people around Little Rock, goes 200 miles from me. A lot of times people think we come from the same place, but we're a long ways apart. And the people I talked to didn't seem very interested in what I was talking about. And so I was talking to Charlie about it this night. I introduced him, and I just met him at night, and I was supposed to introduce him. And I made a joke about it. They told me I was going to introduce a guy named Charlie P. When I got there, I found this guy. And I told him I thought I was going to get to introduce Charlie Pride. I just saw the P. And we got to meeting just by casual and talking, and I found he had a great interest in the big book. In fact, I found he was the only first guy I ever met was interested in what I was talking about. So I couldn't let him go. And this has been, I say in Alcoholics Anonymous, has been some kind of experience, the big book and Charlie and I. And we at the time thought we were the only people that would ever be interested in what we were talking about. And we spent a lot of time over the next few years up to his farm and down over looking out on Saturday morning, studying the big book at the table, looking out over the farm. And it's been just a wonderful experience. Someone asked us at one time, we'd share this in rooms around conferences with other people that would sit in. Then someone asked us to come to a group and do it. And then one thing to led to another. We do things like this. But it's just really wonderful this morning to see so many people and hear about people from all over the country have been benefited from the thing that we love so much, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous.
For a very, very brief history of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, we know that Bill Wilson in 1934 was suffering heavily from the disease of alcoholism. We know that in 1934 it became necessary to hospitalize Bill, and we know that he went into the Towns Hospital in New York City under the care of a little doctor named Dr. Silkworth. And we know that Dr. Silkworth made Bill aware of some facts about the disease of alcoholism. We know that he told him about the physical allergy to alcohol, and we know that he told him about the obsession of the mind, the fact that he could never again safely drink alcohol because of the allergy, and he would never be able to stay sober on his own because of the obsession of the mind. And we know that probably Bill Wilson might have been the first alcoholic to really know and really understand what was wrong with him, what the real problem consisted of. And we know that when Bill left that hospital, he felt that the only thing that'd be necessary for him to do would be stay on guard, and he wouldn't have to drink, and he would be okay. And we know he got drunk very shortly after that. And we know he went back into the Towns Hospital for treatment again. And we know that Dr. Silkworth pronounced Bill incurable, told his wife that this guy's going to have to be locked up, or you're going to have to hire a bodyguard and send with him everywhere he goes, or he's going to die from chronic alcoholism. We know that Bill left the hospital, and we know that he sobered up for a while on fear, but we also know that shortly after that he started drinking again. And we know that Bill had an old friend named Ebby visit him, and we know that Ebby made Bill aware of some things that had been going on in Ebby's life. And we know that he told him about a little six-step or a six-principle concept being used by a group of people called the Oxford Groups. And we know that Bill and Ebby began to try to apply this in their lives, and while trying to apply it in his life, and especially when he went back into the hospital trying to apply it in his life in the hospital, we know that Bill had a spiritual experience in the hospital. We know that Ebby, through his six-step concepts, made Bill aware of the fact that the solution to alcoholism would be the spiritual experience. And we know that through the six-step concept, Bill had this spiritual experience. And we know that he left the hospital in the latter part of 1934, and Bill died in 1971, and we know he never had to take another drink of alcohol as long as he lived. We know that Bill carried these things that had been given to him by Dr. Silkworth and by Ebby and etc. to a fellow named Dr. Bob. And we know that Dr. Bob also experienced the recovery from alcoholism, because for the first time in his life he knew what his problem was, and he knew the solution, and he knew how to apply the solution, because that's what Bill took to him. We know that they in turn went to the hospital and immediately talked to a third fellow named Bill D. And they told Bill D what was wrong with him, and they told him what the solution was, and they told him how to apply the solution. And we know that he got up and went from his hospital bed and never had to drink again. And we know that these three people began to carry the message of alcoholism. What is the disease, and what is the solution, and how do you apply the solution? And we know that in 1937 there was approximately 40 people who had gotten sober on the information that had been carried to them by these original people. And in 1937 it became necessary for them to decide what they were going to do about this thing. You know, they could have decided, well, there's 40 of us and we're all sober and we're living happy and everything's great, and to hell with the rest of them and we'll keep what we've got. You know, thank God they didn't do that, because part of their concept was to carry this message and give it away to other people. And we know that they had a great conflict in 1937 on how to do this. What shall we do? What are we going to do about our message of recovery? For the first time, they realized that they really might have something that would be extremely important to other alcoholics in the future. And they argued back and forth over what to do about this, how best to carry the message, how to preserve the message, how to keep it from being garbled and changed in the future. and finally a decision was made to write a book. And we know that the book was to do many things. One was to make a little money, which it didn't do for a hell of a long time. But we also know that the book was to do the same thing in the written form that they were doing by word of mouth. Because by that time they had begun to receive inquiries coming in from various different states all over the United States, from California, Florida, Texas, and etc. And they knew that they would never be able to see all these people writing into this strange bunch of drunks about a possible means of recovery. They knew they would never be able to see them on a face-to-face basis. And they knew they had to have some way to carry this message in the written form. And they made the decision to write the book, and primarily the book was to do three things. The same three things that we do today on a 12-step call. The book was to first tell us what the real problem of alcoholism is, to explain the exact nature of the illness. Then after explaining the problem of alcoholism, the book was then to give us the solution to the problem. And after giving us the solution to the problem, the book was then to tell us how to find the solution. And you know, these are the three things that are necessary to recover from any problem, period. First, we got to know what the problem really is. Second, we've got to know what the solution is. And third, we've got to understand how to apply the solution. And if we have those three tools, we can overcome any problem that we ever run into. And as we go through the book today, let's bear in mind and try to keep in mind that that's basically what we're going to be talking about. The three sections of the book. And we'll try to bring out, in our opinions, which portions of the book actually describe these three sections as we go through the book. Now, for a long time in discussing the book and looking at the book, Joe and I always said that we feel that everything in the book is extremely important. And there isn't anything in it that we don't need to study. And laughingly, I used to say, if we ever find a reason to study the table of contents, by God, we're going to study that also. And we think recently we've come up with an idea of why we need to study the table of contents in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. Joe?
On the table of contents, we will get into the idea that this is a textbook and how these chapters of the book fit together. As Charlie said, we feel the book does three things for the reader. It shows him what is the problem, what is the solution to the problem, and the plan of recovery, or how to apply the solution, whichever way we tend to call it. And this is basically, as Charlie says, the way we recover from any problem. This is the way a medical doctor solves a problem. This is the way a mechanic solves a problem. First thing the mechanic and the medical doctor do is find out what is wrong. They make a diagnosis. And once you have a diagnosis, then based on the diagnosis, they can prescribe a method of treatment, which is a solution. And then after they prescribe a method of treatment, then they have to carry out a plan to bring about this solution. And as we said, we're using the steps, which are smaller goals of the program. These steps will work under this fashion. The steps will also, step one will show us the problem. Step two will show us the solution. And the last 10 steps will be a simple plan of finding the solution. We say basically the steps of the program of Alcoholics Anonymous will show the alcoholic where he is with step one, and step two will show him where we think he ought to be, and the last 10 steps are a planned way to go from point one to point two. So in the contents of the chapters, we use the chapters as we use the doctor's opinion and Bill's story as the problem section. We use there as a solution, more about alcoholism, and we agnostics as the solution and how it works into action and working with others as a simple plan of recovery.
Okay, and going on then into the book, we'll go first to the preface of the book and take a look at a couple of ideas found in the preface. Then we're going to look at a couple in the foreword to the first edition, and then we'll jump right into the doctor's opinion. Now, the book that I have in front of me happens to be a second edition book. So my preface would read just a little bit different than it would if you had a third edition book in front of you, but only within the first statement. So I'm going to go ahead and read exactly what mine says in the second edition. And mine says this is the second edition of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, which made its first appearance in April of 1939. More than 300,000 copies of the first edition are now in circulation. Because this book has become the basic text for our society and has helped such large numbers of alcoholic men and women to recovery, there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume, describing the AA recovery program, has been left largely untouched. And we feel within that paragraph there's two basic ideas that we might want to look at. And number one, when it tells me that this book has become the basic text for our society. And when it tells me this has become the basic text, this alerts me, I believe, to the kind of book that I have in front of me. You know, we know that there's all kinds of books. We know that there's books that are based on fiction. There's books based on actual fact. There's books that we call biographies and autobiographies. There's novels of all different kinds. And probably the one we're the most familiar with would be a novel. You know, a novel is a book that is meant to entertain you. A novel is a book that is meant to grasp your attention at the front of the book and hold it all the way through and keep it until the very last page. And usually on the last page of the novel, it ends up something like this. They rode off into the sunset together holding hands, and they both had white hats on, and they lived happily ever after for the rest of their life. Gone with the Wind or Rebecca of Sunnybrook Farms or so on and so forth. But we also know that a textbook is an entirely different kind of book. We know that a textbook is a book that is designed to take ideas from one person's mind and put them down in a written form and then transmit them into the mind of another human being. And we know that a textbook is built upon a stair-step principle, where we take one idea, and as we absorb that idea, then we are presented with another idea that it was necessary for the first idea to be understood in order to understand the next idea. And then we have another idea, and then we have another idea, and then based upon these ideas as we go through, we can draw certain conclusions. A textbook is a book that is designed to teach with, designed to learn things by. For instance, if I had a textbook dealing with mathematics, and let's say my friend Joe here knows nothing about mathematics at all. He can't even add and subtract. He can count up to 20 okay if he'll take his shoes and socks off, and if all the things are where they're supposed to be, he can make it up to 20. But he can't do anything really with math. Now, I walk up to Joe and I hand him a textbook dealing with mathematics. And I say, Joe, in this textbook dealing with mathematics, in chapter 5, there are some problems there that are called algebra problems. And I would like for you to open the book up to chapter 5, and I would like for you to work these problems dealing with algebra. And Joe would open up the book to chapter 5, and he would look at these algebra problems. Well, hell, they just look like Greek to him. You know, he says, I can't do this, and he slams the book shut, and he throws it away or he sets it up on the shelf, and chances are he'll never look at it again. But if I would say, Joe, in this math book that I'm going to hand you, in chapter 1, there's some problems in there dealing with addition and subtraction. And I'd like for you to read and study chapter 1 and ask me any ideas that you might have or anything you don't understand. And at the end of the chapter, then, there's some problems dealing with addition and subtraction, and you should learn enough in chapter 1 to work those problems. Go ahead and work them then and bring them to me, and we'll see how you do. And sure enough, through chapter 1, he learns how to add and subtract. And then I say, now, Joe, in chapter 2, there's problems dealing with multiplication and division. And based on what you learned in 1, you should be able to read chapter 2 and then work those problems dealing with multiplication and division. And he does that, and I say now in 3 we deal with fractions and decimals, and gradually Joe is led through a learning process. And when he reaches chapter 5, he then should be able to take all the information that he's learned in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, and he should be able then to apply that to chapter 5, and lo and behold, understand and work the problems dealing with algebra. Now, we feel today one of the greatest mistakes that we're making in Alcoholics Anonymous is that we're taking the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous and we're handing it to new people when they walk in the door, and we're saying, go to chapter 5 and do what it says. And they go to chapter 5 and they open it up and they read how it works and they look at the steps and they look just like so much Greek, just like a bunch of algebra problems. And they close the book and they either throw it away or they put it on the shelf, and chances are they may not look at it again for a long time. We believe that the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous is a textbook, and we believe that it is written on basic textbook principles. And we think that we have to start in the front of the book, and in the front of the book we learn certain ideas. And based on those ideas we can progress to the next chapter, then to the next, and then to the next, and then to the next, and finally we get to chapter 5 and we can work the algebra problems in chapter 5. Today we hope to be able to show you how this comes about, where it's absolutely essential that we understand the first portion of the book in order to be able to do what it tells us to do in chapter 5. I think the other important point that we see in this paragraph is there exists a sentiment against any radical changes being made in it. Therefore, the first portion of this volume describing the AA recovery program has been left largely untouched, which means that through the 3 editions of the big book, that the actual recovery program is exactly the same as it's always been. You know, they changed the book in 1955, and they changed the stories in the back of the book. They added some and they deleted some to more accurately reflect the changing membership of AA. More and more women coming in. The average age was becoming less and less. So they changed some stories around, but the recovery portion, the first portion of the book, has not been changed. In 1976, we produced the 3rd edition, and it was basically changed for the same reason. The stories in the back of the book were changed again to more accurately reflect the membership. But the actual recovery portion has been left untouched. You know, it worked so well in 1939. Up until 1955, they saw no reason to change the recovery portion of the book. It worked so well from 1955 to 1976, they saw no reason to change the recovery portion of the book. So really, it makes no difference which book I have. The 1st edition, 2nd edition, or 3rd edition makes no difference whether I came in 1940, 1950, 1970, or 1980. The recovery portion of the book is exactly the same. Now we would skip over to the foreword to the 1st edition, and we'll look at a couple of points there before going into the doctor's opinion. In the foreword to the 1st edition, it says, "We are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of this book." And again, we think we see 2 points here we need to discuss very briefly. Number 1, we are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. Normally, when I read a book, being the intellectual type alcoholic that I am, and being one who has quite a bit of ego, when I read a book that has been authored by one person, if I don't agree with what that person says, well, I simply say to myself, well, who in the hell are they to think that they know more than I do? And I just ignore that and go right on reading the rest of the book. But when I come to the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, I'm not reading a book which has been authored by one person. You know, we know that Bill wrote the book. But we know also that the original people told him in the writing of the book, they said, Bill, you put this thing together. But they said, as you write the chapters of the book, we want to see them. And we will add to, delete from, or change whatever we feel that is necessary. They said this book is to be the collective knowledge and experience and wisdom of all of us. And this is not to be a book which is a one-person authored book or a book that is one person's story. It is to be the collective thing that all of us have shared together. Now, if I look at it in that point of view, if I am going to argue with the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous, then I'm going to be arguing with 100 people instead of one. And it's a little harder for me to argue with 100 instead of one, and especially when they make the statement that they have recovered from the seemingly hopeless state of mind and body, which is absolutely killing me as a practicing alcoholic. I think the other important thing that we look at here is it says to show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered is the main purpose of the book. You know, I've been in AA long enough, and God knows I've been in enough service work to know that we don't have any rules and regulations in AA. Oh, we have a few traditions that we have to follow for our groups and etc. But we know that nobody can make us do anything that we want to do, don't want to do in AA. We know that the only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. But we also know that if we want to recover from alcoholism, there's probably some things that we should do. As I go around to AA meetings today, I hear statements like this. They say, well, you know, you don't really need to work the 12-step program if you don't want to. After all, we've been coming to this meeting now for 5 years, and we never have worked the steps, and we haven't had a drink yet. Or I hear somebody else say, you know, this is kind of like a cafeteria line. You just take what you want and you just leave the rest on the shelf if you don't want it. Or the statement that I always love to hear them say, they say, well, just keep coming to the meetings and everything will be all right, because this is kind of like osmosis. Sooner or later it'll rub off and you'll soak it in. Well, you know, I'm here to tell you today that I sat around AA for a long time, waiting for it to rub off and soak it in by osmosis, and I damn near died from the disease of alcoholism while I was waiting for that to happen. Nobody can tell me what I have to do in AA. But if I wish to recover from alcoholism, as the first 100 did, then they have shown me in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous a precise, specific, clear-cut method of recovery. And if I would follow their precise method of recovery, then it stands to reason that I should be able then to expect the same recovery that they got from it. Kind of like making a cake. If I come to you to get a recipe for making a cake, and you write it out for me on a piece of paper, and I take it home and I follow your recipe exactly as you have put it down, then chances are my cake is going to be exactly like the cake that you make. But if I decide to change your recipe, if I decide that instead of 3 eggs it needs 4, or instead of half a cup of shortening it needs a full cup, or instead of 2 cups of sugar I need to cut it to 1, or instead of baking it at 325 degrees for 35 minutes, I decide it ought to be 500 for 40 minutes. Chances are when I'm through, I'll have a cake all right, but I doubt very seriously if it'll be like your cake. If I wish to recover as the first 100 did, I have a precise recipe for recovery from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. And if I would follow it as they did, then I would expect to have the same kind of recovery that they had. Joe?
As Charlie says, the program is precise and clear-cut. And we're talking about the Big Book, Alcoholics Anonymous. You know, a lot of times I think we need to really stop and get things in the right perspective. In 1935, the first 100 people, they didn't, is what we know them to be, the first 100 people. It was, And they came up and they wrote this volume that contained a planned program of recovery from alcoholism. After the book was finished, they had they went around and they decided and this and that, and they wanted to find a name for this book. And they finally, after a little discussion, settled on the choice, Alcoholics Anonymous. So the first planned way to treat alcoholism, and the only book ever written to do this, was entitled Alcoholics Anonymous. And the book went out across the country, and they had no idea that this was going to happen when they wrote the book. But as the book began to go out across the country, they themselves decided to call themselves, the first 100 began to call themselves Alcoholics Anonymous. And then they began to generate groups of people who popped up all over the country, and they called themselves Alcoholics Anonymous. So as Charlie says, actually we have to look, we got two Alcoholics Anonymous. Really, Alcoholics Anonymous is a textbook. That's what Alcoholics Anonymous really is. And it has created a fellowship called Alcoholics Anonymous. And then sometimes there's a lot of difference between the program in the textbook and the program in the fellowship. The program in the textbook has not changed, but the program in the fellowship is in a constant change. And as Charlie said, some people have not used the textbook in the right fashion. And I always like to bring out a point that I'm aware of here lately, that some people don't use it at all. A lot of people in the fellowship take the program, take the 12 steps off the wall. And it's pretty hard to take the steps because the instructions of how to take the steps are in the text. And they can't be taken off the 12-step board. So it's just, we are talking about the Alcoholics Anonymous text. We'll come to the doctor's opinion. And the doctor's opinion is in the very front of our textbook. And a lot of times, if this is a textbook, the doctor's opinion is in the very front of the text, then the doctor's opinion should be the basis for the whole book. The recovery program is described later in chapter 5 as how to recover from the condition that he describes in the very front. And sometimes we hardly fail to see the importance of what Dr. Silkworth did for Alcoholics Anonymous. Because remember, he said it was from the doctor that Bill learned the nature of his problem. It was Dr. Silkworth that told Bill what was wrong with him. Dr. Silkworth was at the Towns, and he came up with some ideas concerning this condition. Prior to Dr. Silkworth's work, no one understood alcoholism. Alcoholism, as Jerry was talking about last night, since the beginning of time, no one understood it. And mankind was faced with a dilemma, because when we have a problem we don't understand, then we're a victim of that problem. Right today we have an illness called cancer, and we have a lot of research and a lot of that's going on all over the world, and very inadvertently we would probably say that we are hunting for a cure for cancer. But I'm sure if we talk to the people that are directly involved in the research, they would tell you that they're not hunting for the cure, they're hunting for what is the problem. If they could find the problem, then they could probably locate the cure. The cure already exists, but they can't find it until they know what is the problem. And this is what happened for thousands of years down through. Everybody wanted to know what was wrong with us. And remember, and it's very peculiar. It's not funny, but all this nonsense and all the ignorant ideas and all the things that was accumulated about the alcoholic down through history are the results of this search. The many ignorance that still exist in our society, it come from 2,000 years of ignorance, and they still exist today. But it wasn't, remember now, it was they 1 out of 10 people give it, as they begin to drink thousands of years ago, 10 people began to drink, one of them was an alcoholic. And this has been going on for 2,000 years. Now, it was the sober people who tried to find out what was wrong with the drunk. It wasn't the drunk. He didn't care, you know. So the opinions and concepts of the alcoholic were developed by the non-alcoholic. It was the non-alcoholics who said, we believe he's a tramp. You know, we believe he's weak. You know, who determined this confusion. And no one understood it. They didn't even understand what type of problem was. Was it a moral issue, physical, psychological, sin? I don't know. They just went through the whole gamut. You know, no one. They were in total frustration. And finally, Dr. Silkworth, he wasn't the first person to say it was a disease, but he's the first man to give us a working conception. And he talked about it, you know, being a disease. He talked about it being a condition of the body and the mind. And in most illnesses, you know, many, we divide our treatments of human beings basically into three categories to the human life. We have a spiritual life, that certain category. We have people that deal in that area. We have mental health. We have a mental life, which deals with people in mental health and psychiatry. Then we have physical problems, which is in the medical world. Three basic areas to human life. Most of the times, you know, these are all treated by separate specialists. If it's and they run the alcoholic from place to place. For 2,000 years, they sent him to the preacher, and they sent him to the priest, and then they would send him to the head shrinkers, and then from the head shrinkers to the medical doctors, and boy, they switched him back and forth trying to find out which end was up, you know. And finally, you know, it was Dr. Silkworth who discovered this was a dual problem. And most major health problems with man are not dual, they are singular. But he discovered that this was he said, a physical allergy coupled with a mental obsession. And he said, in a discussion in the doctor's opinion, he begins on page 24, Roman numerals, the physician at our request who gave us this letter has been kind to enlarge upon his views in another statement which follows. In this statement, he confirms that we who have suffered alcoholic torture must believe that the body of the alcoholic is quite as abnormal as his mind. It did not satisfy us to be told we could not control our drinking just because we were maladjusted in life, that we were in full flight from reality or were outright mental defectives. These things were true to some extent, in fact, to a considerable extent with some of us. But we are sure that our bodies are sickened as well. In our belief, any picture of the alcoholic which leaves out his physical factor is incomplete. So we're talking about something that was unique and still unique today. We're talking about a disease that is part in the body and part in the mind. And as we go through this, the doctor's opinion, I think that this is the first step. We're talking about the first step. And I think that the greatest thing, a lot of people fail in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and we know that these ideas interlock. And I think that the greatest failure in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous, and this is my opinion, is in the first step, about the only failure. We don't fully grasp the exact nature of our problem. Therefore, we can't accept maybe the solution or carry out the treatment plan. The failure lies within the first step, because we don't fully comprehend the nature of our illness. And you know, he tells us exactly the exact nature of our problem, and he begins to talk about the physical allergy. The doctor's theory that we have an allergy interests us. As laymen, our opinion of its soundness may of course mean little, but it explains, but his as ex-problem drinkers, we can say that his explanation makes good sense. It explains many things for which we could not otherwise account, and it really does for the alcoholic. The doctor's opinion is about the only place today in Alcoholics Anonymous is still, with all the things that's going on, Alcoholics Anonymous is about the only place a drunk can find out what's wrong with it. Now, over on page 26, he says, we, of the Roman numerals, we believe, as so suggested a few years ago, that the action of alcoholics on these chronic alcoholics is a manifestation of an allergy, that the phenomenon of craving is limited to this class and never occurs in the average temperate drinker. And he's talking about the physical side of the disease, and it's entitled an allergy. And we know by looking deep into the word allergy, and I think that here throughout the big book that Bill used words specifically with their deepest meaning, and I know that ideas are conveyed by words, and words are instruments to convey ideas, and they have to be conveyed exactly. I think about driving down the street sometimes and see somebody that goes through a stop sign, and they have an accident and carry them to the hospital, and the police investigate, say, what happened? He said, well, I slowed up there. He said, well, that ain't what that sign said. It said stop, And we have to get exactly what these words mean. And we know an allergy is an abnormal reaction to a food or chemical compound, or a reaction that is different from normal. So he's saying that we have a different reaction than normal. And I have a lot of problems with that, and I think many people do, because, if we have an abnormal reaction to alcohol, then in order to understand what is an abnormal reaction to alcohol, we have to first understand what is a normal reaction to alcohol. And I was reading an article, and it said the normal person takes a drink, and he feels dizzy, and he feels nauseous, and he feels out of control. That's what I heard. That's what I never did feel that way. And if I felt dizzy and noisy and out of control, I wouldn't take but two either. I wouldn't take one. When I felt in control, But when we take alcohol into our systems, we know that alcohol has to be metabolized throughout the system, and the body is a very marvelous process. Chemically, as a lay person, I understand. I'm amazed at what a beautiful, and we are God's greatest creation. We look all over, but still, man is the most magnificent thing on the face of this earth. We're so complex, and our body's handled. We are a very complex system with thousands of different chemistries going on within the body. These chemistries are making adjustments all throughout the day on some sort of something that controls them. And when something comes into the system, then our body reacts to these chemistries in a certain way to make this thing stay precise so that we'll be healthy. And alcohol is a depressive drug. When it's put into the system has a built-in way of handling alcohol. Our bodies know how to handle alcohol. When alcohol comes into the system, there's certain chemistries in the system react to the alcohol and eliminate it from the system. Normal people just take a drink and they metabolize this alcohol and process it right through. But what he's saying that we do not handle it as normal people. When we take alcohol, we understand that it processes through a system that leaves something in our system or handles it. We don't handle it like other people. And it produces an abnormal reaction. And normal people take a drink and they might take another one, or they really let it get hot, or they'll sit around and sip on it and just do something like that. And the alcoholic takes a drink and his body doesn't handle it in the same fashion. And it triggers in him a phenomenal craving. The alcoholic, and what is different is that factor. The alcoholic craves alcohol when he drinks it. We don't know why this occurs. We don't know why this is different. It's like any other allergies. But once the phenomenal craving starts in the alcoholic, he continues to drink and drink and drink until alcohol causes him a problem. So I think that the allergy is to alcohol, as the doctor said, there's no known cure for this. He says maybe one day medical science will, he said, but right now, only thing we suggest is entire abstinence. And it's just like treating any other allergy. If you go to a doctor and you got an allergy to strawberries, and you don't know what's wrong with you, you got a bad rash, and he'll go there and ask some questions, and he'll find out, well, you've been eating strawberries. And then he'll say, well, I believe you're allergic to strawberries. And then he'll suggest entire abstinence, because he says, I believe you shouldn't eat no more strawberries. But really, he didn't cure you, but he just told you, he just gave you some information. And this is the way we treat all other allergies. And once we don't take the first drink, we'll never experience this phenomenal craving. Throughout the big book, throughout the doctor's opinion, he gives us some illustrations over and over about the allergy to alcohol. Men and women drink essentially because they have liked the effect produced by alcohol. The sensation is so elusive that while it is injurious, they cannot at a time differentiate truth from false. To them, the alcoholic life seems the only normal one, and that's really strange. But that's, I always did crave alcohol. So that was normal to me. And there was no way for me to know I was abnormal, because I thought that other people used willpower. I said, well, I don't have willpower, but they don't use willpower either, because they don't crave it. They don't have to use willpower. They are restless and irritable and discontent unless they can again experience the sense and ease and comfort which once by taking a few drinks, which they see others taking with impunity. After they had succumbed to this desire again, as so many do, and the phenomenon of craving develops, they pass through the well-known stages of the spree, emerging wrought with a firm resolution not to drink again. This is repeated over and over again unless this person can experience an entire psychic change. There is little hope for his recovery. Down at the bottom of that page, I do not hold with those who believe that alcoholism is entirely a problem of mental control. It's not just mental. I have had many men who have, for an example, worked for a period of months on some problem or business deal which would be settled on a certain date favorable to them. They took a drink a day or so prior to that date, and then the phenomenon of craving at once became paramount over all other interests, so that these important appointments were not met. These men were not drinking to escape. They might have took the first drink to escape. They were drinking to overcome a craving beyond their mental control. He talks about, throughout this, he gives us these examples. In the next paragraph, we won't go through these in details, but I think there are 5 different types of people that are mentioned in these paragraphs. The classification of alcoholics is beyond the scope of this book. We talk about the different ways and things we do and the behavior, and he said this is really not important. Some alcoholics do this, some alcoholics do that. Some, as Charlie says, some becomes a lover, some becomes a fighter. We take on all kind of roles when we drink, and this has really nothing to do with it. We got them 20 questions, and they'll drive you up the wall. You don't need but one. He says all these have one symptom in common. Only but one question. Okay, all these and many others have one symptom in common. They cannot start drinking without developing nominal craving. That's it. If you crave alcohol when you drink, that's the only question you need. That's all. It's just plain that simple. This phenomenon, as we suggested, may be the manifestation of an allergy, which differentiates these people and sets them apart in a distinct entity. It has never been by any treatment which we are familiar, permanently eradicated. The only relief we have suggested is entire abstinence. So he talks about this allergy as being a physical allergy, and actually it gets worse by age. I realize today I haven't had a drink in over 21 years, but if I had a chemical deficiency to handle alcohol 21 years ago and it hasn't been treated, then it should be worse. So I am actually worse for this condition, although I have not had a drink of alcohol. The allergy is worse. Now, the other part of the illness he talks about, he talks about it later on in our book, says we think, although this is true, just don't take the first drink and you will never crave the second drink. Now that's so simple. Look like any smart guy like Mike could figure. If you never take the first drink, you will never crave the second drink. Now that's simple. Golly. It hurts me. I was so dumb I couldn't figure that out. You know. Ain't nothing complicated about this. Now the other half, but the trick is that's half of the problem, and part of it is I can't drink because of that. I can't drink without doing that. So the other part of the book says later we think the main problem of the alcoholic sinner is in his mind. Now he went on to say we're restless and irritable and discontent, and I was a lot of other things when I didn't drink. And it talks about the mind, and the mind would build up these things. And somewhere I learned that doing one of these things early in my life while doing this, that I noticed while drinking I felt better. I noticed while drinking I felt better. So I associated these two things together. Next time I felt bad, my mind said, take a drink. My mind fed me the success before. We remember success. My mind refed me this success. And so I started playing this game over and over again. And my mind would become restless again, and my mind would feed me the idea to drink. And I would feel bad. A few months later, my mind would feed me to do what I did the last time. I began to play this game over and over and over again. When I become restless and irritable and discontent, it says my mind would remember the sense and ease and comforts. That's an obsession. And you know, this obsession would be triggered. And once the obsession was triggered, it would make me reach over and take a few drinks of alcohol. And it would depress my emotions, but it would also go over and set off the physical part of my allergy. And the craving would take over, and I'd go through the well-known spree. And this cycle was repeated over and over in my life. The mind triggered the body, and the body triggered the mind. Because the more the mind made me take a drink, the worse my body chemistry got, the stronger the craving got. The stronger the craving got, the more I drank. And the more I drank, the more problems I had on the other side to recycle it again. And I had two problems. You know, I had one, I couldn't drink because of the body. And the sum total is that my mind, because of my mind, I couldn't quit drinking. And we're talking about the first step, you know, because it tells us what the exact nature of our problem. If you can't drink because of the body and can't quit because of the mind, then you're powerless over alcohol. And he says the main problem centers in the mind, and this is really true because this is the main problem of the alcoholic. And I think, you know, we were very blessed for Dr. Silkworth. It was Dr. Silkworth who explained this to Bill. Bill didn't know. He was like me. He didn't know what's wrong with him. And based on this is the first step. And Dr. Silkworth gave it to Bill and put it in the front of the big book in the doctor's opinion. And this is the foundation of the big book, Alcoholics Anonymous, the first step. Doctor's opinion to understand the exact nature of my problem.
I think in dealing with the doctor's opinion, he makes it so simple that if we aren't careful, we simply overlook what he's really telling us. You know, he says the allergy of the body manifests itself by the phenomenon of craving. To understand that, we had to understand what the word allergy meant. And we went to the dictionary and we found out the word allergy meant an abnormal reaction. Most people that eat strawberries have no abnormal reaction. Once in a while, a person eats strawberries and they react abnormally, and it manifests itself as breaking out in a rash. Most people can drink milk safely. Every once in a while, one will drink milk and they will have an allergic reaction, and it manifests itself as a bad case of dysentery. We alcoholics, when we drink alcohol, the manifestation is the phenomenon of craving. It's not necessarily a visible thing. It's not a rash, not necessarily dysentery. Sometimes it turns into dysentery, but the manifestation of the allergy is the phenomenon of craving, the misunderstood craving. That is so strong that it's impossible for us to stop after we once start. This does not occur to the normal drinker. This is the physical side of the disease of alcoholism. Down at the bottom of that page, he said, men and women drink essentially because they like the effect produced by alcohol. They're restless and irritable and discontented, unless they can again experience a sense of ease and comfort, which comes at once by taking a few drinks. Now that would indicate that he's talking about people whenever they're sober, and they're restless and they're irritable and they're discontented. And we add words to that. They're full of shame and fear and guilt and remorse and all the good things that go along with alcoholism. And the mind begins to seek a way to feel better. Those are all mental feelings. Those aren't physical feelings. And the mind remembers what alcohol did for us the last time we drank. And it remembers how it made us feel. And eventually the mind will key in again to taking a drink, and maybe it will argue with itself and say, no, you can't drink because you went to jail last time, or you got in a divorce court, or you had a car wreck. And it may argue with itself back and forth. And eventually the mind, in seeking that relief, says, let's have a drink. And we take the drink because of the way we feel before we take the drink. And then after we take the drink, we trigger the phenomenon of craving, and then we can't stop drinking, and then we get drunk. But just before taking the drink, we're sober. So what Dr. Silkworth is really saying to me is, if I want to stay sober, I better find a way to live and be sober and not be restless and not be irritable and not be discontented and not be filled with shame and fear and guilt and remorse, because otherwise my mind will key again into taking a drink. And I take the drink and I trigger the allergy. You see, the allergy only comes into being after taking the drink. I have to take the drink first to trigger it off. And he makes it so simple that we quite often overlook it. Now, I don't know why people drink. You know, a lot of people argue back and forth that they drink because they like the taste of it. And I wouldn't argue with you about that at all. You know, I love the taste of cold beer. But I also love the taste of cold mountain spring water. And I never did sit down and drink a case of cold mountain spring water. Never. When I took a drink of alcohol, I knew exactly what it was going to do for me. You know, I drank it because it made me feel good. How many times have I walked out to the trunk of the car, and it's sitting out in the sun, and it's 150 degrees in that trunk, and I've popped the lid, and I reach in, and I get out a bottle of vodka, and I take the lid off of that vodka, and I raise it up, and I take a big slug of it, and I say, God, ain't it good? No, it wasn't worth a damn. But I knew if I could get it down there and keep it down there, I knew what it would do for me. That's why I drink alcohol. Why you drink, I don't know. Dr. Silkworth describes me exactly. And as Joe said, the meaning of these words is very important. We must understand what the book means when it says certain words. It's kind of like the highway patrolman. The guy ran through the stop sign, and the highway patrolman pulled him over and said, Buddy, what do you mean running through that stop sign? And the guy said, well, it doesn't mean stop to me, it just means slow down. He said, when you slow down to 5 miles an hour, nobody coming either way, what's the reason for stopping? And the policeman said, I'm going to teach you the reason. And he pulls out his nightstick and he starts beating him on the head. And in about 5 minutes, he says, now, do you want me to stop or slow down? I bet he never had any trouble with that from that day on. All right, Dr. Silkworth gave us then the basis for the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous. He described to us very simply, very easily, what the problem really is. A physical allergy of the body coupled with a mental obsession of the mind. The physical allergy ensures that we get drunk when we try to drink. The obsession of the mind ensures that when we're sober, we can't keep from taking the first drink. Therefore, we are powerless over alcohol. Now, if you can't drink alcohol without getting drunk, and you can't keep from drinking alcohol, then your life is damn sure going to be unmanageable. If it isn't already, it's sure going to reach that point. So he gave us the real problem. Now that it becomes necessary for us that we found a problem out, it becomes necessary to begin to look then for what is the answer to the problem. Remember that the big book was written with the idea in mind that it really is going to be the 12-step call in print. Remember, in the beginning, there was only a few people, and they were all back in the northeastern part of the country. Remember, we had inquiries coming in from California and Florida, Texas, and various other places. And the only AA that these inquiries were going to see was going to be what was within the big book. So the big book then was to take the place of the face-to-face 12-step call. And it had to do exactly the same thing that you and I do today, and that they did then when they made a face-to-face 12-step call. You know, today when we go out on a 12-step call, and as they did it then also, when we go out and talk to another drunk, we don't talk to him about his disease of alcoholism. I better read this. This is a little notice. Cars on Main Road holding up traffic. A blue Buick, license number FAWJC762, a white Chevy, FADC3101, and a what is that, Joe? What's that last one? Brown something with a license number of FABJS433. Anybody got that car? They better go move. Oh, a Lincoln. Okay, all right. Okay. Where was I? When we go out on a 12-step call today, we don't talk to that person so much about his disease or his drinking. We tell him about our disease of alcoholism. We tell him about what happened to us. We tell him what alcohol did to us and a possible means of recovery and how we apply that in our life. And then what happened because of that application. We are the only people in the world that are able to really talk with another alcoholic, because we are the only people in the world that have experienced the same thing that he is experiencing. You know, the doctor talks to the alcoholic, and it really doesn't make any sense because the doctor really doesn't understand. The minister talks to the alcoholic, and it doesn't make any sense because the minister doesn't understand. The psychiatrist talks to the alcoholic, and it doesn't make much sense because they don't really understand. We understand, and in talking with the alcoholic, we can do one thing that nobody else can do. We can bring about immediate identification by telling them our story, our disease, our recovery, what happened to us. When we once have gained their attention, we then can begin to talk about their problem and their recovery and etc. But until we've made the identification process, little or nothing can be done. Now, the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous recognizes this in the very beginning. In order for the alcoholic to begin to believe that they might be able to recover from the hopeless condition of the mind and body described by Dr. Silkworth, they're going to have to be able to see that somebody else has recovered. And as we talk to the new alcoholic about our recovery, we can begin to see in their eyes the beginning of the belief that if this happened to us, maybe it could happen to them. You know, they're not even going to get up and go to an AA meeting with us unless they can identify with us, unless they can begin to believe there might be something to this after all. And we believe in the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous that chapter 1, Bill's story, is put here in exactly this place for this purpose. The doctor's opinion has described to us the hopeless condition of the mind and body. Bill's story is there to show the person who's reading the book there is a possibility of recovery from this hopeless condition of the mind and body. Bill's story is there to begin the beginning of belief through the identification process. And some people say, well, I can't identify with Bill and his story because Bill was a New York City lawyer and stockbroker, and Bill was a Vermont Yankee. Well, I'll agree with you that it is kind of hard to understand him once in a while. A New York a Vermont drunk Yankee, it'd be hard to understand, period. But if we look at Bill's story, we can identify with Bill's story. In Bill's story, he talks about that great drive for success in the very beginning. The great drive to show somebody that, by golly, he's somebody and he's going to be somebody. And I believe every alcoholic has this great desire to prove to the world that we are as good as they are or better. In Bill's story, we begin to see the steady progression of alcoholism. We see Bill beginning way back early, starting to drink and occasionally getting too drunk. We see Bill going into business, and we see him becoming a success in business, and parallel with that, we see the drinking becoming worse and worse and worse. In Bill's story, we begin to see how he starts making decisions whenever drinking that causes him to lose not only his money, but other people's money too. In Bill's story, we begin to see the loss of respect of his business partners and of his wife, and the respect that he had for himself. In Bill's story, we begin to see as the alcoholism peaked, the rest of the life went to hell, and Bill's life became unmanageable. In Bill's story, we see that it was necessary for him finally to be hospitalized for his drinking. In Bill's story, we see where his brother-in-law and his wife took him to the town's hospital. In Bill's story, we see where Dr. Silkworth talked to him and told him about the disease. In Bill's story, we see where he decided he would stay sober based upon this knowledge. And we saw him go out and try to stay sober based upon that knowledge. And we saw one day the obsession to drink return. And Bill took a drink and triggered the allergy and started the rat race all over. And we saw him drink and drink and drink until he couldn't drink anymore, and they put him back in the hospital again. And we saw Dr. Silkworth pronounce him incurable. And Bill said, they didn't need to tell me that. I knew I was going to die from alcoholism. And we saw him go back out on the streets again. And we saw him stay sober based upon fear. And in Bill's story, we see that on Armistice Day of 1934, he found himself sitting in the bar, drunk, wondering how in the hell they get here this time. You know, it isn't really hard to identify with Bill if we read his story and read it carefully. Everything that happened to Bill happened to me. A different time, a different place, a different way. But everything that happened to Bill happened to me. And as I read and studied Bill's story, I said to myself, well, this guy just like I am. You know, this occurred to Bill in 1934. It was occurring to me many years later. But the same identical things over and over and over and over again. We see in Bill's story the beginning of recovery from alcoholism. We see not only the progression of alcoholism until it peaked, but in Bill's story we are allowed to see the beginning of recovery from alcoholism. The same thing that you and I carry to a person on a 12-step call. They can see recovery in us as we begin to talk about our recovery. And right after the break, we're going to take a look at Bill's beginning recovery from alcoholism and the actual beginning of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. Let's take a 15-minute break. Let's try to be back in here at 10:30. And then we're going to run till maybe 10 till 12, and then we'll quit for the day.